At the age of 64, James Worthy still stands there like a solid landmark in NBA history, even if he's no longer called out much in the noisy conversations. He was the #1 pick in the NBA draft of 1982, stepping into the Los Angeles Lakers when that team was already packed with legends, and he still found his place, not with words, but with responsibility. 3 NBA championships, 7 All-Star appearances, Finals MVP in 1988, with a near-perfect Game 7. Those numbers don't tell the full true value of Worthy. The value lies in how he always showed up at the right moment, when the game needed a finisher, when pressure crushed every mistake, when the other stars were tightly guarded. Big Game James wasn't a brand cooked up by the media. It was a title forged in those finals nights, where one slow step meant failure. He ran non-stop in the Showtime system, cutting to the basket, finishing, defending, doing everything needed to make winning happen. His Hall of Fame induction in 2003 recognized that career, but even when honored, Worthy still stepped back, as if the achievements were just a job completed, not a reason to hog the spotlight. But behind those victories is a story rarely told, the quiet pain and the will that doesn't need witnesses. Worthy's body was worn down by the brutal pace, by the repeated collisions, by knees that gradually betrayed the speed that once was his greatest weapon. He didn't complain, didn't ask for rest, didn't demand special treatment. When he had to leave the court early, he left in silence, no farewell ceremony, no grand speeches. Worthy's personal life was as private as the way he played. A broken marriage didn't become headlines. A legal incident didn't turn into a long defense story. He withdrew deeper, choosing to take responsibility instead of explaining. Worthy's will wasn't about returning to center stage. It was about continuing to stand tall when the lights went out. He accepted time passing through him, accepted history telling the story without calling his name first. James Worthy's pain wasn't failure. It was the long silence after doing everything right. And it's precisely in that silence that his will shines clearest, not collapsing, not turning bitter, just quietly standing firm when the world had turned in another direction. If you want to understand why a legend can do everything right and still get faded in collective memory over time, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next part. If the later part of James Worthy's life was covered by the spotlight and the selective applause of history, then the early part of his life began in a completely different place, Gastonia, North Carolina, a small southern town in America, where everything ran on discipline, silence, and rules that didn't need explaining. It wasn't a tragic childhood in the usual sense. No alcohol, no family violence, no hungry nights or screams through the walls, but that very normalcy created a tragedy much harder to name. The Worthy family was the kind that believed kids didn't need too much coddling, that responsibility mattered more than feelings, that growing up meant learning to stand on your own without anyone holding you up. His parents were strict, diligent, hard-working, and expected the same from their children. They weren't cruel people, but they also weren't the type to say we're proud of you. Hugs were rare, praise was almost non-existent, and in that house, emotions weren't forbidden, but they weren't encouraged to exist either. James grew up in that atmosphere, where every pain had to be packed away neatly, where tears weren't scolded but also weren't wiped away by anyone. He learned very early that showing emotion brought no reward. No one patted his shoulder when he was sad. No one stopped to ask why a child was too quiet for too long. Instead, he was taught to keep going, to finish the job, to endure. Over time, James Worthy stopped trying to express emotions. He learned to swallow them, like swallowing a dull ache without naming it. In Gastonia, strength wasn't about standing up in protest. It was about not letting anyone see you weak. Worthy grew up exactly to that mold. A quiet boy, no trouble, no demands for attention, but also no idea how to ask for comfort when he needed it. School wasn't a place of release either. The conservative South valued order and propriety, and James fit into it perfectly, to the point of almost disappearing. He wasn't the kid who made a strong impression, nor the one teachers mentioned with special emotion. He existed steadily, quietly, finished his part, and moved to the next day. Other kids learned to express themselves with words, personality, rebellion, or laughter. James learned a different lesson: if you don't say it, no one objects; if you don't show it, no one hurts you. That was a self-defense mechanism formed very early, and it became the foundation for the man he later became. Sports entered James Worthy's life not as a romantic dream, but as the only space where emotions were allowed to exist without explanation. On the court, he didn't need to say he was angry, sad, or craving recognition. His body spoke for him. The runs, the bursts of speed, the powerful finishes became the only language he felt safe using. There, no one asked how he felt. They just watched whether he got the job done. And James Worthy got it done. He did it very well, but precisely because of that, no one noticed that behind that steadiness was a child who had never been taught how to recognize his own pain. The real tragedy of James Worthy's childhood wasn't in what happened, but in what didn't happen. No moment of being held tight after a failure. No affirmation that his worth didn't depend on performance. No one stopping to say that silence could also be a sign that needed to be heard. In that world, James learned to exist without bothering others, and gradually, he also stopped bothering himself by questioning his own feelings. The seed of tragedy was planted there. Pain that isn't acknowledged as pain doesn't disappear, it just learns to wait. Many years later, when James Worthy stood in the biggest arenas of world basketball, with tens of thousands cheering and millions watching on screens, that boy from Gastonia was still there. No crying, no complaining, no demanding. He was used to being seen for his performance, not for his person. And from very early on, he was used to the idea that if a pain wasn't big enough to interrupt the work, it didn't need to be mentioned. That tearless childhood created an extraordinary enduring man, but also a man carrying voids that aren't easy to fill. James Worthy's tragedy began there, very early, very quietly, in a home that lacked nothing material, but lacked what every child needs: the recognition that their pain is real and deserves to be heard. Leaving Gastonia to enter the University of North Carolina, James Worthy didn't bring a dazzling dream, nor a craving for attention. He brought what had followed him through childhood: discipline, silence, and the habit of completing the assigned task without asking if anyone was watching. UNC was a harsh environment, in a very different way from the quiet South, where Worthy grew up. Here talent was the bare minimum, and competition was the constant state. Every practice was a test. Every game was a filter. No one cared where you came from, what your family was like, or how many unfilled voids you carried inside. In Chapel Hill, there was only one question: can you meet the standard? And James Worthy met it, quietly, consistently, without making noise. He wasn't the face the press chased from the start. UNC had other names that drew attention: players who talked more, showed clearer personalities, were easier to turn into stories. Worthy was different. He didn't try to build an image. He didn't need to prove he was special. On the court, he ran, cut, finished, defended, did exactly what the system required. Off the court, he didn't create presence. No shocking statements, no quotable moments. To the media, James Worthy was the hard-to-grasp type, too steady to stir controversy, too reserved to become an emotional icon. And in an environment like UNC, that was both an advantage and the beginning of a very personal tragedy. The 1981-1982 season passed with mounting pressure. The team went deep, expectations rose, and every game became a nerve test. Worthy stayed the same, unshaken. He didn't play to impress, he played to not disrupt the structure. When teammates struggled, he filled the gap. When the defense opened, he attacked. No one had to call his name for him to appear. He appeared because that's where someone needed to appear. And then, in the 1982 NCAA championship game, the moment thousands of college players dream of their whole lives, James Worthy scored the decisive points. A clean, unflashy play, no cinematic drama, but enough to seal the national title. For many, that moment would be the time to explode, to dance, to scream, to release all the built-up pressure. But James Worthy didn't. The cameras caught him turning his back and running toward defense, as if the game wasn't over yet, as if joy could wait. No fist pump to the air, no eyes searching for the lens. no emotional release that people usually expect from a champion. He finished the job, and that was enough. The win happened, but no one had taught him how to celebrate it, and perhaps he didn't know how anyway. At that point, few realized that the 1982 NCAA moment wasn't just the first victory in James Worthy's career, it was also the complete blueprint for the rest of his life, accomplishing something great, but not knowing, or not allowing himself to enjoy it. For Worthy, joy always carried a sense of unsafety. Joy requires showing, and showing can lead to disappointment, so he kept joy to a minimum, like a reflex formed very early. On the college court, that made him reliable, but deeper down, it also locked away his ability to share his own emotions. The NCAA title opened the door to the NBA, and Worthy stepped through that door with the same stride. No looking back, no lingering celebration, no pausing to wonder whether he deserved to feel proud. UNC had given him the victory, but it also unintentionally reinforced a quiet belief: your value lies in what you do for the team, not in the emotions you experience while doing it. James Worthy left Chapel Hill with a championship, a wide-open future, and a habit deeply ingrained in his blood: if you complete the task, keep moving forward. Don't linger too long. Don't ask whether you're happy. The tragedy that ran through his entire life began to become clear from this point, not because he didn't win, but because each victory passed too quickly through his mind. Not because he wasn't great enough, but because he had never learned to allow himself to enjoy that greatness. UNC gave James Worthy a historic moment, but it also taught him a harsh lesson: finishing an important job doesn't mean you're allowed to stop and feel it. And that lesson, no one knew would follow him on the long road ahead, where bigger victories awaited, along with deeper loneliness that he still had no language to name. Stepping out of Chapel Hill with the fresh NCAA championship in hand, James Worthy barely had time to understand what his college victory would unlock before the 1982 NBA draft placed him in a position that allowed no hesitation. Pick number 1, the first choice. On paper, it was the pinnacle of recognition, but in reality, it was the moment expectations began to press down, like an invisible weight. The Los Angeles Lakers weren't waiting for a rookie to rebuild. They already had Magic Johnson, the radiant soul of Showtime, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a monument already carved into history. James Worthy walked into that locker room, not to be introduced as the future of the team, but as a piece that had to fit immediately. No apprenticeship period. No right to make mistakes. No space to be vulnerable. In Los Angeles, the lights were so bright they showed no mercy for any delay. For another young player, joining a legendary roster might have been inspiring. For Worthy, it was a quiet reminder that he wasn't allowed to become the center. He was picked number 1, but he wasn't treated like someone permitted to experiment with himself. Every run was measured against the standard of those who were already history. Every mistake was magnified by the context the Lakers created. Their potential had no value unless it immediately turned into results. And James Worthy, who was used to completing tasks without demanding attention, understood that faster than anyone. He didn't try to seize a leadership role. He didn't attempt to become the face of the team. He chose the quieter path: do everything right, and do it now. But it was precisely that choice that opened the core tragedy of his career. The number 1 pick is usually expected to become the main character of the story. For Worthy, the number 1 pick became a restraint. He wasn't allowed to fail, but he also wasn't allowed to claim the spotlight. He existed in a strange gray zone, too important to be overlooked, but too disciplined to be told as a romantic legend. While Magic smiled and led, while Kareem scored with moves that had become classic, Worthy ran to fill the gaps, ran to finish fast breaks, ran to keep the rhythm for a machine that couldn't afford to slow down. No one demanded that he become the hero, but no one allowed him to miss a beat either. In Los Angeles, a mistake wasn't just a bad stat. A mistake was a betrayal of expectation. And James Worthy lived his early NBA years with the clear awareness that every stumble wouldn't just be his own. It would shake the entire system. He didn't complain about that pressure. He swallowed it. just as he had swallowed emotions since childhood. The Lakers' strictness resembled his family more than he realized: few compliments, many demands, and a quiet belief that if you're strong enough you'll endure. Worthy endured. He endured so well that people gradually took that endurance for granted, not allowed to err, not allowed to weaken, and especially not allowed to become the main character. On a team where every story revolved around bigger names, Worthy learned to live in the role of the finisher, the one who stepped in at the right moment to close the game's door, the one who did the hard work but didn't demand praise. His career didn't begin with explosive debuts, but with a string of days proving he wouldn't ruin anything. And it was right there that the tragedy quietly began to take shape, living an entire career in the role of someone not permitted to fail, but also not permitted to be celebrated as the sole winner. James Worthy carried the expectations of a #1 pick on his shoulders, but he carried them in a way no one could see. No outbursts from a young star, no public defiance, just a quiet determination that he would not be the weakest link. In Los Angeles, that was enough for him to survive. But it was also exactly that which slowly stripped something else away from him: the right to tell his own story. When expectation becomes a constant burden, when every victory is treated as duty, James Worthy began his NBA career in a painful paradox: chosen first, but never allowed to live as the one in front, and he accepted it, because from very early on, he had learned that some roles, no matter how heavy, don't allow you to say no. When James Worthy truly blended into the machine called the Showtime Lakers, he stepped into a rhythm that left no room for hesitation. Showtime wasn't a style, it was speed. It wasn't a philosophy, it was a requirement. Games flowed like a torrent, fast break after fast break, pass after pass, bodies stretched to their limits on every burst. In that whirlwind, Worthy was the one who ran the most, collided the most, and appeared at the finishing points that demanded absolute precision. While Magic Johnson conducted the tempo with a smile and vision, while Kareem Abdul-Jabbar maintained order with the steadiness of a monument, Worthy was the one who turned ideas into results. He attacked the gaps before they closed, caught passes in a split second, finished when the entire system waited for an ending that wasn't allowed to be wrong. Showtime needed someone like that, and James Worthy became that person, without needing to be called by name. But that speed didn't come free. Every game was a silent bargain with his body. Every fast break was another push past the limit. Worthy ran because the system demanded running. He collided because the pace didn't allow dodging. Under the bright lights of Los Angeles, those impacts weren't recorded as sacrifice. They were seen as the necessary part of victory. People talked about Magic's no-look passes, Kareem's skyhook, the blazing scoreboard at the end of games. Few talked about the legs carrying constant load, about the repeated heavy landings, about knees stretched in silence. The team's success hid the individual exhaustion, and that very concealment made Worthy's pain invisible. In the locker room, no one asked, "Can you still handle it?" Showtime had no room for that question. It assumed that if you could still stand, if you could still run, then you had to keep going. James Worthy understood that better than anyone. He didn't complain, didn't ask for reduced minutes, didn't seek special treatment. He carried the old habit from Gastonia and UNC: finish the job first, emotions later. But later in Showtime almost didn't exist. Today ended, tomorrow began with the same intensity. Back-to-back games stacked up, and in every game, Worthy was given the heaviest task, but the least mentioned. He didn't need to initiate, he had to finish, and finishing at the right moment always drained more than people imagined. The glory of Showtime came fast, bright, and addictive. Each championship was a confirmation that this style was right, that this pace was worth it, that individual sacrifice made sense. But those very confirmations also locked Worthy into his role. When the team won, no one had reason to look deeply at signs of fatigue. When the trophy was raised, no one stopped to count how many bursts had taken away how many percentage points of health from a player who already lived by speed. Collective victory swallowed individual health, and it did so with such glamour that every question felt unnecessary. James Worthy wasn't forced to become a hero in the media sense. but he was forced to become someone who couldn't slow down. Every completed fast break taught the system it could demand more. Every silent collision told the machine no adjustment was needed. His durability became the prerequisite for the pace's brutality. And so the tragedy didn't need a single explosive moment to form, it grew in the habit of winning. There were nights Worthy left the court with legs heavy, not because they lost, but because they had won in a way that didn't allow rest. He didn't need the crowd to know he was tired, he only needed the final score to favor the Lakers. Showtime taught him that the joy of victory was enough to cover everything else, but covering isn't the same as healing. Beneath that glow, small wear accumulated, dull pains learned to exist without drawing attention, and James Worthy, used to swallowing emotions, continued to swallow his body's warning signals too. The tragedy of this phase wasn't one sudden injury, not a fall that stopped everything. The tragedy was the normalization of exhaustion. It was each victory raising the bar for the next game. It was the system having no incentive to ask whether the human inside it was still whole. Worthy stood at the center of that vortex, fulfilling his role with cold precision, and slowly paying the price with things that never appeared on highlight reels. The Showtime Lakers are remembered as one of the greatest teams in NBA history, and James Worthy was an indispensable part of that glory. But precisely because he was a part, his pain never stood alone to be named. It dissolved into the victories, into the cheers, into the celebration nights he rarely allowed himself to truly join. When history mentions Showtime, it talks about speed and joy. Few mention the price paid by those who ran the fastest, and among them, James Worthy ran until winning became a habit, while his body quietly kept the ledger. No one asked if he could handle it, because he always could. No one stopped to check if it was sustainable, because the results kept coming. And so the tragedy moved forward, without tears, without warnings. In glory traded for self, James Worthy learned one more harsh lesson: when winning becomes the standard, individual sacrifice is never seen as abnormal. And it's precisely that normalcy that inflicts the deepest wound. The Game 7 of the 1988 NBA Finals arrived like a destiny. James Worthy had been prepared for his whole life to face, yet he was never taught how to receive it. Everything converged in that moment, the pressure of a series stretched to its limit, the Los Angeles lights shining straight onto every stride, and the cold demand that this game allowed no mistakes. Worthy stepped onto the court with his familiar calm, no declarations, no signs of excessive excitement, and then he played a near-perfect game: 36 points, 16 rebounds, 10 assists, a rare triple-double in a finals Game 7, where history doesn't remember those who did just enough. He appeared in the right place, at the right time, finished when opportunities opened, defended when lockdown was needed, and kept the Showtime machine running until the final beat. That was the night the nickname Big Game James stopped being praise and became the ultimate confirmation. The finals MVP came to him like history's official stamp. No one could argue, no one could say Worthy didn't deserve it. In the moment he raised that individual trophy, James Worthy was seen, acknowledged, placed exactly where he had held his ground through the harshest years. But if you look closely, he accepted it not with emotional release, but with quiet acceptance, as if he understood that this title wasn't a reward, but the inevitable result of pushing himself to a place with no way back. That night, he didn't just beat the opponent, he beat the expectations that had weighed on him since the day he was picked number one, beat the role of the one not allowed to fail that he had lived with. But even in the moment history recorded most clearly, another paradox began to form, because to achieve that perfect night, Worthy's body had been pushed beyond unwritten boundaries. Every burst in Game 7 was another withdrawal from a health account already depleted by Showtime's pace. Every landing after a finish was a quiet reminder that knees don't forget anything. The greatest game wasn't played only with skill and composure, it was played on loans the body would repay later bit by bit. When the final buzzer sounded, the scoreboard favored the Lakers, and history had what it needed to remember. James Worthy's body also began keeping its own record. In the glow of Finals MVP, no one asked how many collisions he had to endure to maintain that pace. No one asked when the pains appeared during the game, and how he ignored them. A big win has a strange power, it makes every warning sign feel unnecessary. When a player performs his best in the most important game, everything else is allowed to be downplayed, and James Worthy, accustomed to not showing, had even less reason to speak up. He had fulfilled his role in the most absolute way, and the world kept moving, believing this peak moment was a solid foundation for the future, but that peak was also where the clock began counting down. Not because Worthy declined immediately, not because he no longer had value, but because from that point on, every demand placed on him was raised while his body no longer had the capacity to expand further. The 1988 Game 7 set a new standard when needed. James Worthy would do the extraordinary, and once established, that standard would never return to the old level. Every following season, every following playoff series, carried the expectation that he could recreate that night, despite the physical conditions required for a perfect night gradually leaving him. There is a subtle tragedy here. If Worthy had played poorly in Game 7, perhaps history would have been gentler with his body, but because he played perfectly, because he reached a peak very few touch, no one had incentive to question the price paid. Glory obscures the truth that no peak is free, and for a player who lived by speed, by explosive cuts to the basket, every percentage of decline is a loss that can't be hidden forever. The 1988 Finals MVP was the moment James Worthy was named most clearly, but it also marked the last time the world was forced to look straight at his central role. After that, history began to slide in the familiar way. Subsequent wins belonged to the team, stories were told around more recognizable icons, and Worthy returned to the task finisher position. Only one thing changed. After that night, every time he completed a task, his body paid a higher price than before. Worthy didn't complain, he didn't use the Finals MVP title as a shield, to ask for reduced load. He didn't turn that perfect night into a reason to demand privileges. Instead he kept playing as if it was duty, not a peak. That very humility, which is an admirable quality, unintentionally prolonged the chain of sacrifice. When a great player demands nothing for himself, the system keeps demanding from him. And the Showtime Lakers system, nourished by victory, had no reason to stop. Placing this paradox at the center of the story, we see that the tragedy of Big Game James isn't that he wasn't recognized. He was recognized, very clearly, very officially. The tragedy lies in how that moment of recognition made the road ahead narrower. The greatest game became a haunting standard. The individual title became a reminder that when needed, he had to do it again, even though his body had changed. The clock didn't make a sound, but it started running from that night, tick by tick, slowly and mercilessly. James Worthy left Game 7 of 1988 as a champion, but also as a man who had stepped onto a point of no return. Every peak after that was compared to that perfect night, and every pain was overlooked because of the memory of a moment when he proved he was the most reliable when everything was on the brink of collapse. Big Game James was born in victory, but the price of that name was a future where every stride carried the shadow of loss that began in the very moment of greatest glory. After the perfect night of Game 7 in 1988, James Worthy moved into another phase of his career without clear boundaries, without a buzzer to signal it, without a moment to mentally prepare. It didn't start with a dramatic fall but with small, quiet, repeated signals, light enough to be ignored, persistent enough not to disappear. Worthy's knees, which had carried the load for years under Showtime's destructive pace, began to degenerate in an irreversible way. At first it was stiffness after games, then mornings getting up a few beats slower, then pains appearing without reason, like a reminder that the body doesn't forget any debt it's owed. But for James Worthy, those signs weren't treated as warnings, they were treated as the inevitable part of getting the job done. Lingering pain became a baseline state, no longer an event. It was there when he warmed up, when he sprinted, when he landed after the cuts that defined him. Some days the pain eased, some days it clung like a shadow, but at any level, it was never big enough to force him to stop. And in a system accustomed to Worthy always being there when needed, stopping wasn't an easily accepted choice. Painkiller injections became part of the routine, not because they healed, but because they allowed him to continue. The shots didn't bring long-term hope, they just bought more time, one game at a time, one quarter at a time. Worthy understood that. He didn't fool himself that everything would be fine. He just needed his body quiet enough to fulfill his role one more time. Endurance, in that context, wasn't a heroic act, it was a habit. James Worthy didn't stand in front of a mirror telling himself to be strong. He simply didn't know any other way. No complaining, no asking for rest, no seeking sympathy. From Gastonia to Chapel Hill, from the Lakers to the finals, he had learned that his value lay in whether he showed up, not in how he felt. And when his body began to betray him, that lesson didn't change. He didn't speak about the pain, because he wasn't sure who would listen, and even if someone did, he wasn't sure it would bring anything beyond disrupting a well-running system. The silent tragedy of this phase lay in the fact that pain had no right to complain, not because Worthy was forbidden to speak, but because every structure around him implicitly understood that if he could still take the court, then he must take the court. Showtime had no room for fragility, playoffs had no room for hesitation, and James Worthy, who had built his reputation on absolute reliability, couldn't be the first to break that logic. Every time he stepped onto the court, despite stabbing knee pain, he reinforced a dangerous belief that his pain could be ignored without immediate consequences. But the body doesn't operate on the scoreboard's rhythm, it remembers, it accumulates. And in the years after 1988, James Worthy began to lose small but decisive percentages of what made him who he was. Speed. For a player who lived by bursts, by unannounced cuts to the basket, every bit of decline was a cut into his identity. Worthy still played effectively, still completed tasks, but the moments requiring absolute explosion became rarer. He had to calculate more, choose more carefully, compensate with experience for what his body no longer provided for free. And while the world still saw a reliable James Worthy, only he felt the growing gap between what he wanted to do and what his body allowed. There were nights he left the court, not because they lost, but because he felt he had used up the last of what was left for that game. There were practices where he had to extend his warm-up by a few extra minutes, not to improve, but just to reach a point where he could endure. But those moments were rarely told, because they didn't fit the victory narrative. People remember the numbers, the decisive plays, the final result. Few remember that a player had to get injections just to step onto the court, or that he had to negotiate with his own body on every single stride. James Worthy didn't see himself as a victim of injury. He also didn't view continuing to play through pain as some heroic feat deserving of honor. For him it was simply the next part of the duty that began the day he was picked number one. But it's precisely that calm acceptance that made the tragedy deeper. When a man endures in silence for too long, the world forgets that endurance has limits, and when those limits are crossed, the consequences don't arrive as a dramatic moment, they arrive as a slow, hard-to-reverse decline. No complaining, no asking for rest, the very things that once earned respect for James Worthy now locked him into a dangerous loop. Every time he chose to continue, his body stepped back one more notch. Every time he stayed silent, the system gained one more reason not to adjust, and so injury stopped being a single event and became the foundation for the rest of his career. Big Game James still showed up when needed, but the price for that presence grew higher and higher, and fewer people noticed. The silent tragedy of James Worthy in this phase wasn't that he was forced to play while in pain, it was that he didn't allow himself to question whether it was worth it. He had been taught, from very early on, that completing the task was the most important thing, and when his body began to betray him quietly, he didn't see it as a warning to stop, he saw it as another challenge to overcome in silence. But the body doesn't negotiate, it only waits for the right moment to reclaim what was taken. And in that prolonged silence, the clock began ticking faster, heading toward an ending James Worthy never wanted to think about, but was never allowed to avoid. When James Worthy reached 1994, his career didn't end with a carefully considered decision, it ended with a reality that could no longer be negotiated. His body delivered the verdict before his will could argue back. Degenerating knees, persistent pain, and irreversible decline turned continuing to play from a question of should I into can I. For someone who had lived his entire career in the role of the one not allowed to slow down, being forced to stop was a quiet shock, not loud, but profound. James Worthy didn't leave the NBA because he had run out of desire. He left because his body no longer allowed him to do what his identity demanded. Retirement in 1994 came without a grand tribute, without a scripted farewell tour, without highlight reels replaying glorious moments to long applause. The Showtime Lakers had become a closed chapter, and the NBA at that time was shifting to new stories. Worthy, who had given his entire career to Los Angeles, quietly stepped off the stage the way he had always known, without demanding attention. No one disputed his legacy, but no one stopped long enough to say a proper goodbye either. When a player always completes the task without making noise, his departure is easily seen as just part of the natural cycle. The most painful thing wasn't that he wasn't honored enough, it was that he never had time to prepare for the ending. James Worthy had never learned how to say goodbye, because he had never allowed himself to think about that day. In his mind, every season was just the next chapter to get through, not a step back to reflect. When his body forced him to stop, he had no time to adjust his identity from player to something else. That transition, already difficult for any athlete, became harsher when it came early and without warning. Being forced to stop by his body, not by his will, created a void that's hard to name. Worthy didn't leave feeling he had done everything he wanted to do. He left feeling interrupted, like an unfinished sentence. There were plays he knew he no longer had the speed to execute the old way, and that very awareness made continuing to play feel cruel. He could still exist on the court, but he didn't want to exist that way. James Worthy never wanted to become a shadow of himself, and when the only choice left was to continue in pain or stop before losing his identity, he chose to stop, even though his heart wasn't ready. There was no farewell story to tell, because there was no farewell moment arranged. One day he was still a Laker, the next he was no longer on the roster. The silence surrounding that decision reflected exactly how he had lived in the NBA, working in silence, enduring in silence, and leaving in silence. But silence doesn't mean peace. In the first months after retirement, Worthy had to face a question he had never had to answer: if there's no more basketball, who am I? For someone who defined himself by showing up at the right moment in the biggest games, that sudden absence felt like having his familiar language for connecting with the world taken away. The tragedy of retiring early wasn't the years lost, it was being stripped of the right to choose the timing of the end. Players who get the farewell they want have the chance to tell their story, to close the journey with words and ritual. James Worthy didn't have that chance. He didn't get to look at the stands and say thank you in his own way. He didn't get to stand at center court and feel the closure. His career ended like a breath held in, not exploding, not settling fully. And in that silence, another kind of pain began to form. Not the pain of injury, but the pain of never getting to say goodbye. James Worthy gave everything he had to the NBA, and when there was nothing left to give, he left without a final echo. But that very fact makes his story more heartbreaking. Because some people don't leave the court because they finished the journey, they leave because the journey didn't give them any more time. And James Worthy, who once appeared at the right moment in the biggest moments, wasn't allowed to choose the moment to say his final goodbye to the game that defined his entire life. After leaving the court in silence, James Worthy stepped into another front of life, without a scoreboard, without a final buzzer, and without an audience to witness it. His personal life didn't collapse in one dramatic moment, it wore down over time, just like his knees had worn down under Showtime's pace. Worthy's marriage ended not because of loud scandals or exposed betrayals, but because of prolonged silence, because of unfilled gaps when his career had taken all the remaining energy. When a man spends his entire youth becoming the most reliable person on the court, he often forgets that relationships also need emotional presence, not just responsibility. James Worthy didn't recount his marriage to the press. He didn't write a memoir to explain. He didn't step into the spotlight to seek sympathy or understanding. When it all ended, he chose to withdraw, as if it were a natural reflex. For Worthy, speaking pain had never been a familiar choice. From Gastonia to the NBA, he had learned that enduring in silence was the safest way to survive. And when the marriage broke, he applied that same lesson, even though the price was no longer physical, but human connection. Not seeking sympathy meant no one knew what to ask. Those around him only saw a calm, polite James Worthy, no complaints, no bitterness. They didn't see the conversations that had stopped happening, the empty evenings after his career had closed, or the sense of disorientation when both pillars, basketball and family, were no longer in their old places. Worthy didn't turn sadness into a story. He let it exist as something private, without public language. And in a world that only records what is spoken, that wordless pain gradually became invisible. Choosing silence wasn't because James Worthy didn't feel the loss. On the contrary, it was precisely because he felt it so clearly that he didn't want to expose it. Some people believe silence is a way to protect dignity, to hold on to some control when everything else has slipped away. Worthy was that kind of person. He didn't want his personal life to become an extension of his career, didn't want what broke to be analyzed like a lost game. But silence, when prolonged, doesn't just hide pain from others, it forces the person inside to face the pain alone. After retirement, when there was no more schedule to fill the days, the voids became clearer. Basketball had once given Worthy structure, a reason to wake up each morning, a system to belong to. When that structure vanished, personal life revealed cracks that had previously been covered by a packed schedule. The marriage didn't end because of one single mistake. It was the result of years of misplaced priorities, of unnamed emotions, of a man more accustomed to completing tasks than sharing burdens. The tragedy of this phase lay in the fact that no one knew what he had lost except him. No big headlines, no public opinion accusing or defending, no public moment for society to acknowledge that a legend can also fail in private life. James Worthy lost a part of his life that he never recounted, and therefore it doesn't exist in collective memory. But not being remembered doesn't make the loss smaller, it only makes it heavier, because it wasn't shared. There is a special kind of loneliness when someone who is used to living amid crowds has to learn how to exist in silence. Worthy didn't try to fill the void with noisy new relationships. He didn't use his old fame to draw attention. He chose to step back, live privately, keep his distance. To many people that appeared as composure, but inside, it was how he protected himself from having to explain things he wasn't even sure he fully understood. James Worthy's personal life after retirement wasn't a series of public tragedies, it was a slow wearing away. Each passing day didn't bring new events, but it also didn't bring clear healing. And in that silence, Worthy continued to live the way he always had, without calling for attention, without demanding acknowledgement for what he had endured. But that very fact created the deepest tragedy of this part of his life. When no one knows what he has lost, no one can fully understand how much strength it took for him to keep moving forward. James Worthy wasn't destroyed by a broken personal life. He didn't collapse, didn't turn bitter, didn't disappear, but he carried an unnamed sadness, a part of life that closed without any farewell ritual. And just like his career, that personal life ended not with applause, but with prolonged silence, a silence that only holds full meaning for the person living inside it. 2010 appeared as an out-of-place crack in the portrait James Worthy had kept almost perfectly intact, not because the incident was too big, but because for decades before that, he had lived a life so disciplined, so private, that any deviation became magnified in the public eye. The legal issue that year didn't destroy Worthy's legacy, but it created a moment he couldn't fully control, something rare for a man accustomed to keeping everything within strict boundaries. In a life that had already imposed harsh standards on itself, just one slip was enough to become a lingering question mark. James Worthy didn't offer long defenses. He didn't launch a media campaign to tell his story in the most favorable light. He didn't turn the mistake into a speech about the pressures of fame or personal circumstances. In the face of that incident, his familiar reflex appeared again: withdraw, accept, and stay silent. For Worthy, public explanation had never brought peace. He understood that words could prolong a story rather than close it, and so instead of arguing with public opinion, he chose to retreat, letting time do its work. Not fighting for his image meant accepting being seen through a simplified lens. In the public's eyes, the 2010 incident became a short headline, detached from the full context of a life of discipline and sacrifice. Worthy knew that, but he also knew that trying to repair his image with words could further damage the values he had built: composure, personal responsibility, and refusing to blame circumstances. He didn't try to turn himself into a victim of scrutiny, nor did he try to appear untouchable. He simply stepped back quietly, accepting that sometimes silence is the only form of accountability he trusted. After that incident, James Worthy withdrew even deeper from public life. Appearances became rarer, conversations became more private. He didn't vanish completely, but he clearly added another layer of distance between himself and the spotlight. For someone who had once been forced off the court before he was ready, actively withdrawing this time carried a different meaning. It was a choice. Worthy didn't want the rest of his post-retirement life to be defined by one offbeat moment. He chose to protect what remained of his privacy, even if that meant accepting being misunderstood. The tragedy of the 2010 incident wasn't the mistake itself, it was that it happened to a man who had already lived too harshly with himself. James Worthy wasn't someone accustomed to letting go or crossing lines. Both his career and personal life were built on principles of control, discipline, and responsibility. When a small mistake appeared in that context, it wasn't just an incident, it was a collision against the image he had maintained through years of silence and sacrifice. And precisely because he didn't resist, didn't justify, that crack lingered in public memory longer than necessary. For James Worthy, that incident wasn't a collapse, it was a bitter reminder that no life is completely immune to mistakes. He didn't use it to make a comeback, nor did he use it to refresh his story. He left it there, as an unwanted but real part of the journey. And then he kept living, more quietly than before, more privately than before, as if every step afterward was weighed more carefully to avoid hurting what was left. In a life that had been too strict, a small mistake can weigh far more than its nature. James Worthy understood that, and instead of fighting that reality, he accepted it with the same attitude he had once accepted injuries, early retirement, and private losses. No complaints, no blame. The 2010 incident became the only crack on the clean image he once had, but that very crack also revealed a deeper truth, that behind the disciplined, silent image was a human being, not perfect, but brave enough not to run from the consequences of moments of weakness. After the 2010 incident, James Worthy fully stepped into a different life. No more arguments, no more confrontations, but also no more center stage. His post-NBA existence wasn't complete disappearance, it was a state of suspension, present but no longer needed in the way he once was. Worthy became a commentator, sitting behind the analyst desk, talking about games he once carried on his own body. His voice stayed calm, his analysis precise, no boasting, no placing himself at the center of the story. He understood the game. He spotted small details only someone who had lived under that pressure could notice. But in that new role, he was the storyteller, no longer the one deciding the outcome. Sitting on the sidelines of history is an experience hard to name. Worthy watched the Lakers move into a new era, new faces, new stories, new legends written at the speed of modern media. Nights honoring the past happened often, but the focus no longer belonged to his generation. Showtime became archival footage, fast-forwarded to make room for the present. James Worthy appeared in the frame as a witness, not as an ongoing part. He was invited to recall, not to be asked what it felt like for the man who once carried the team when the lights went out. No one asked him how it felt to watch his old team move forward without needing him anymore. No one asked if commentating on a playoff game brought back the pains in his body. No one asked what it felt like to see young players praised for things he once did as duty. The sports world operates on cold logic. When you still contribute directly, you're heard. When you're only memory, you become background. James Worthy understood that rationally, but emotions don't always follow logic. Being a commentator kept him close to basketball, but it also constantly reminded him that his role had changed irreversibly. He no longer had the power to influence the game's rhythm, no longer the ability to fix mistakes with action. Every comment, no matter how accurate, stayed just words. For someone who once defined his value by showing up at the right moment to close out games, That shift carried an emptiness hard to admit. He wasn't jealous of those still playing. He simply faced the reality that the world no longer needed him the way it once did. The tragedy of post-NBA life wasn't that James Worthy was completely forgotten. He was still respected. His name was still mentioned in historical lists, but that respect felt finished, no longer urgent. He was recognized for what he had done, not for what he might still do. And that difference, for a man who lived his whole life in the state of must be there, was a profound mental shift. Being replaced not by personal decision, but by the natural flow of time, left no one to blame, and no one to complain to. James Worthy didn't resist it. He didn't try to pull attention back. He didn't make shocking statements to remind the world of himself. He sat there, doing the new job with the same old discipline, as if accepting that this was the unavoidable next part. But that acceptance didn't mean there was no sadness. There is a very particular sadness when you see the place you once belonged continue to run smoothly without needing your presence. It isn't bitterness. It's the cold realization of human replaceability in winning machines. The Lakers moved into a new era, and James Worthy became one of those recounting the old era. He spoke of big games with the accuracy of someone who was there, but never placed himself at the center of the story. He let history speak for him. And while audiences listened to his sharp analysis, few realized that every word was also a reminder to himself that he once belonged on the court in a way that would never return. The tragedy of this phase lay in the normalization of being replaced. There was no collective moment of mourning, no pause to ask a man who once carried the team how it felt to no longer be needed. The world kept going, and James Worthy kept going with it, but at a different rhythm, slower, quieter. He wasn't pushed out, but he was no longer at the center. And sometimes, for someone who lived by showing up at the exact right moment, not being called at the right time anymore, is the hardest loss to put into words. As time pulls away from the Showtime years, history begins to select memories in its own cold way. The stories that get retold over and over usually need louder voices, more recognizable icons, faces tied to a clear central narrative. Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Kobe Bryant, eras get linked to those names, and every time history is retold, they stand in the foreground. James Worthy gradually fades into the background, not because he lacked achievements, but because his story doesn't fit the noisy rhythm of storytelling. Worthy didn't disappear because he was less important. He disappeared because he didn't represent a single-threaded legend. He wasn't the creator of Showtime's radiant smile, wasn't the enduring symbol of a unique skill, and wasn't the lone star carrying an entire era. He was the finisher, the one who appeared at the right moment to lock down the game, the one who did the hardest work while all eyes were on brighter spots. But popular history prefers clear straight lines over subtle links. It remembers the loud storyteller more than the one who kept the story running smoothly. Gradually, in summaries, Worthy's name appears like a footnote. Big Game James gets mentioned as a nostalgic nickname, no longer as a living presence in emotional memory. Highlight videos speed through his cuts to the basket, then linger longer on Magic's smile, Kareem's skyhook, Kobe's icy stare. No one deliberately excludes Worthy. He simply gets edged out by the logic of storytelling. History isn't malicious, it just picks what's easiest to remember, easiest to tell, easiest to sell. James Worthy didn't fight it. He didn't stand up to demand fairness, didn't write long essays to correct collective memory. He understood that arguing with popular history usually just makes the silence last longer, and beyond that, resistance was never his way of living. Throughout his career, he worked in the gray zone, too important to be overlooked, but too disciplined to become the center. After retirement, that habit didn't change. He let the story drift, trusting that those who truly understand basketball would remember his role without needing reminders. Not demanding fairness doesn't mean he didn't feel the loss. There is a quiet sadness when you know you were there in the biggest moments, but collective memory only keeps a piece of the picture. Worthy didn't need to be worshipped as the leader, he just wanted to be remembered accurately. But accurately is a fragile concept when history is told through icons, silent roles. No matter how decisive, are hard to compete with stories that have clear climaxes. The tragedy lies here. History isn't malicious, but it's indifferent. It doesn't hate James Worthy. It simply doesn't pause long enough to ask what he did to make the other legends shine. It isn't curious about the price he paid to finish big games. It doesn't take time to put him at the center once and explain why he deserved it. History moves on, because its job is to progress, not to look back and make amends. James Worthy accepted it with the same calm that shaped who he was. He didn't need to win any more games to prove himself, but that acceptance didn't make the paradox disappear. The less he resisted, the more he was seen as background. The more silent he stayed, the less reason collective memory had to self-correct. And so, while other names got repeated until they became myth, Worthy existed as a hard-to-package truth, a man who did everything right but didn't own an easy-to-tell story. There were moments, when documentaries scrolled through the past, Worthy saw himself in fleeting frames. It wasn't jealousy that rose, but a strange feeling, as if he were watching his own life through someone else's eyes, condensed and rearranged to fit storytelling needs. He knew he had been there, had carried the load, had closed out games that history only remembers for the result. But knowing and being remembered are two different things. The tragedy of James Worthy in this chapter isn't complete forgetting. He still has his place in the Hall of Fame, still commands respect from experts. The tragedy is the gap between truth and collective memory, between what happened and what gets retold. That gap isn't loud, doesn't spark big debates, but it erodes over time, blurring a portion of his contribution. And perhaps what's hardest to accept is history's indifference. No one deliberately hurt James Worthy. No one stood up to say he wasn't important, but no one stood still long enough to say he was an irreplaceable link. History passed by him the way it passes by so many who did the heaviest work without holding the microphone. And James Worthy, who was used to living without needing to be called by big names, kept walking in that truth, no resistance, no demands, carrying the tragedy of a legend whom collective memory only recalls when needed to fill a footnote line. As the big stories fade further into the past, James Worthy entered a phase of life with no scoreboard to measure by, no schedule to cling to, only his body, the thing that followed him through his entire career, continuing to speak in its own way. The long-term consequences of injury didn't vanish the day he retired. They stayed persistent and patient, like deep markers etched on a road traveled too fast. Knees that once carried thousands of bursts no longer respond the way they used to. Some mornings, his body needs more time to wake up than his mind does. Some days, even a simple movement is enough to remind him that old debts are still being collected, with no room for negotiation. The days when his body no longer obeyed arrived without warning. It wasn't always sharp pain, sometimes just stiffness, an unresistible slowing. But that unpredictability is what wears you down. For someone who once lived by control, controlling pace, position, timing of finishes, having to accept that his body could refuse orders was a harsh lesson. James Worthy didn't get angry at his body. He understood that relationship had lasted a lifetime, and what was happening now was the result of choices made in a context that allowed no other choices. Living slower because he had to was a hard truth to name. It was different from choosing to slow down to enjoy. For Worthy, the slower pace came as a medical requirement, a condition of existence. Activities that were once instinct now had to be weighed. Distances once covered in a few strides, now measured in caution. He learned to ration energy for a day, not for a quarter. And in that process he realized endurance no longer lay in accelerating, but in accepting limits without letting them define his entire self. Not bitter, but not easy either. That was James Worthy's mental state when facing old age carrying pain. He didn't look back on his career with public regret. He didn't say he wished he had done things differently, but there was no romanticizing either. He understood the price paid clearly, and didn't need to sugarcoat it. The pains outlasted his career, and that forced him to restructure how he lived, how he thought, how he showed up. Some days he missed the court not for the lights, but for the feeling that his body still obeyed, still answered commands fully. In everyday life, Those consequences showed in small details: having to pause midway to rest, having to avoid sudden movements, having to listen to his body before deciding something that once seemed simple. No one saw those things on TV. No documentary slowed down the moments he weighed each step, but that's where the quietest tragedy existed, when pain stopped being an event and became the baseline. James Worthy didn't let pain turn him into someone difficult. He kept the calm that had shaped him from early on. But calm doesn't mean comfortable. Some nights sleep came slowly. Some mornings he woke feeling like he'd just finished a long game, even though nothing special happened the day before. Body memories, in their way, kept playing. And every time that happened, he was reminded that some victories never fully close. They carry consequences that can't be stored in a trophy case. The difference between Worthy's youth and old age wasn't just years, it was how he had to interact with himself. While playing, he could ignore pain to finish the task. Now, ignoring wasn't an option. Listening became a survival skill. And in learning to listen, he found a new kind of patience, not explosive, not showy, but enduring. Patience to walk slower without seeing it as defeat. Patience to accept that good days and bad days would alternate, not on schedule. The tragedy of this part of life wasn't the decline itself, but its length. James Worthy's career had a clear start and end. Pain didn't. It stretched on, changed shape, sometimes faint, sometimes sharp, but rarely left completely. And because it outlasted his career, it forced him to carry memories of what he achieved while living with the consequences of how he achieved them. There was no way to separate the two. They were bound together, like two sides of one journey. Even so, in that stretching out, James Worthy didn't lose his dignity. He didn't turn pain into the central story to seek attention. He kept it in its place, a part of life, not the whole of life. He learned to rearrange days around what he could still do, instead of what was lost. And in that, a quiet kind of peace emerged, not because everything got easier, but because he learned not to let pain define him. James Worthy's old age had no climax. It had a slow rhythm, clear limits, days when he had to accept stopping earlier than planned. But it also held an undeniable truth. Pain outlasted his career, yet the qualities that made him who he was, discipline, calm, responsibility, outlasted too. And while the lights went out long ago, the way he lived with pains that never disappeared became his most enduring game, where victory wasn't measured by cheers, but by the ability to keep walking, slowly, but without falling. Stepping through the lingering pains of old age, James Worthy leaves behind a legacy that isn't loud, isn't named big enough to become a slogan, but is real enough that it can't be denied. His contribution never needed exaggeration. It exists in the results, in the way a team ran smoothly, in the games that got locked down at the right moment when everything risked slipping away. Worthy didn't build his career on easy-to-tell stories. He built it through presence at the right time, by showing up when needed most, and stepping back once the task was done. And that's exactly why his legacy is hard to package into neat media images. Worthy's influence wasn't publicized the way people do with icons. There's no single defining moment to replay forever, no unique skill to clip into shorts. His influence spread more quietly, making those around him better, making the system work more efficiently, making victory arrive without needing to name the one who brought it. In a world that loves main characters, Worthy chose the role of the finisher, and that role, no matter how decisive, is still hard to sell to collective memory. A kind of greatness that's hard to sell is often mistaken for a lesser kind of greatness, but the truth is, to finish the job too well without claiming the spotlight requires a rare mental discipline. James Worthy didn't need to prove he was the center to know his value. He let the results do that. He accepted that when everything runs perfectly, few ask who kept the gears turning at the right rhythm. The tragedy arises right here: when you do the job too well, people get used to you being there, and gradually forget they need to call your name. Worthy's legacy therefore exists in the gaps of the story. In the footage that fast-forwards without pausing long enough. In the summaries that place him in the second row because the first row already has enough recognizable names. No one deliberately downplays him. History just follows its own inertia, favoring icons that are easier to label over subtle links. And Worthy, who was used to living in the gray area between necessary and invisible, accepted that inertia as an unavoidable part. The tragedy of the man who finishes the job too well isn't that he isn't honored, it's that he isn't fully understood. When a player always does the hardest part without showboating, collective memory records the win without digging into how the win was made. James Worthy became proof of that paradox. He is widely respected, but rarely told in full. The respect stops at everyone knows he was great, without going further to ask how much did he pay to be great in that way. Honoring James Worthy with truth, not with glow, requires saying plainly that he isn't easy to tell. He doesn't fit the quick mythologizing mold. He fits stories that need time, need context, need patience to understand the role of a finisher in a great system. He doesn't need to be inflated to become bigger. He needs to be placed correctly, so it's clear that without him, many moments wouldn't have ended the way history records. That legacy also carries an uncomfortable lesson for how we remember sports. We often love the louder storyteller, the one standing at the center of the frame. But elite sports doesn't run on centers alone. It needs people willing to carry the unglamorous work, willing to accept that collective victory will overshadow individual marks. James Worthy embodied that willingness, and precisely because he did it too well, he became a legacy hard to name big enough. There is no bitterness in how Worthy faces this. He doesn't demand history be rewritten. He doesn't ask media to fix headlines. He lets the truth exist, trusting that time, if fair enough, will distinguish between fleeting glow and enduring contribution. But truth also needs someone to speak it, and when spoken, it needs to be spoken in the language of reality, not with gloss. James Worthy isn't a man of easy-to-sell stories. He is a man of right endings. In an era where lights decide memory, his legacy reminds us that some greatness isn't in being named loud, but in making the right thing happen at the right time, over and over, until winning becomes habit. The tragedy is that habit makes people forget who sustained it. And the most deserving honor, therefore, isn't adding more glow, it's returning truth to its place. James Worthy finished the job so well that history treats it as if it happened on its own. Back in the present, at the age of 64, James Worthy doesn't stand in front of cameras to reclaim a lost position. He doesn't sit there blaming history for telling the story differently. Today's James Worthy is a man living slowly, calmly, with a body bearing the marks of unforgiving years, and a spirit that has learned to exist outside the lights. He holds no resentment. Resentment takes energy, and Worthy used that energy for games he wasn't allowed to lose. He also doesn't beg to be remembered. Begging collective memory is a different fight, and that was never his style. There is a very particular stillness around James Worthy, not the stillness of failure, but the stillness of a man who has walked the full road he was given. He wasn't broken. He didn't collapse under injury, under early retirement, under private losses, or under moments history skimmed past. But he was left behind, not by malice, but by noise. The noise of bigger stories, easier to remember icons, legends told in ways that fit media rhythm. In that noise, those who finish the job too well often have no space left to speak. James Worthy paid the full price. He paid with a body worn down earlier than time should have. He paid with having to leave the court before he was ready. He paid with relationships eroded in silence. He paid with watching his legacy exist more as a footnote than a headline. But what stands out is that he doesn't demand a refund. No bitter interviews, no tell-all memoir, no effort to redefine himself through anger. Worthy accepted that price the way he once accepted his role on the court. No fanfare, no bargaining. At 64, he doesn't try to prove he's still relevant. He understands relevance is temporary, while truth lasts longer. The truth is James Worthy was there, in the biggest moments, doing the hardest work, and leaving without breaking anything. The truth is that without him, many victories wouldn't have had the endings history records. And that truth doesn't need to be shouted to exist. It just needs to be said right, once, without embellishment. Some people lose their battles. James Worthy doesn't belong to that group. He won the battles he was given, more times than he was asked. But he lost his place in the noise, where stories have to compete to be remembered. And that is his subtlest tragedy. Not failure, not collapse, but the mismatch between real value and how much gets retold. A man can do everything right, and still not be placed at the center of the story when it's summarized. The message for American audiences isn't in pity, but in recognition. Some men don't lose their battles, they lose their place in the noise. There are people who don't lose because they're weak, but because they don't hold the microphone. Not because they aren't important, but because they make everything run so smoothly it's taken for granted. James Worthy is a reminder that sports, and life itself, aren't built only by those remembered most, but by those who carried the heaviest responsibilities, without demanding attention. This epilogue doesn't end with liberation, or a moment of reclaimed lights. It ends with standing firm. James Worthy wasn't broken. He keeps living, carrying pains that don't disappear, carrying a legacy not named big enough, and carrying the calm of a man who knows he paid the full price for what he believed was right. In a world of noise, that is a silent victory, not flashy, not easy to remember, but real. And sometimes real is all that remains when every cheer has faded. The story of James Worthy leaves a quiet sadness, not intense but lasting, because it isn't about a man who fell, but about a man who did everything right, and was still pushed out of the center of memory by time. From a disciplined but emotionally reserved childhood in Gastonia, Worthy learned to swallow feelings and complete duty instead of demanding recognition. All that pattern repeated through his life. At UNC, he scored the decisive points to win the NCAA title, but didn't know how to celebrate. With the Lakers, despite being the #1 pick, he accepted not being the main character, running the most, colliding the most in Showtime, while no one asked if he could handle it. The peak of Game 7 in the 1988 Finals, where he won Finals MVP with a perfect game, was also when the clock of loss began running, body pushed beyond limits, knees degenerating, painkiller shots to keep playing, then early retirement, in 1994 without fanfare. The greatest sorrow lies in what wasn't seen, a marriage that broke in silence, the 2010 incident, without defense, and the post-NBA phase, when he sat commentating on the sidelines of history, watching the Lakers enter a new era while no one asked how it felt for the man who once carried the team. History isn't malicious, but indifferent. It shouts the names of Magic, Kareem, Kobe, while Worthy becomes a footnote, even though his legacy is what helped those stories end happily. The lesson for American people isn't in mourning, but in awakening. Society easily honors the one holding the microphone more than the one finishing the job. In real life, there are James Worthys everywhere, doing the hardest part, enduring the most, and leaving in silence. Honoring them doesn't need glow, it needs the fairness of memory, remembering the role correctly, asking the right questions, and understanding that value isn't always loud. If the story of James Worthy makes you think about the people who did the heaviest work without being named big enough, subscribe to the channel so we can keep telling stories like this. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we continue to honor the silent greatness behind the lights.